Hello everybody, welcome to the webinar Succession Planning, Organizational Stability, and Leadership Development.
Hi folks, this is Zach Ford at Age United. Thank you so much for joining us on today's webinar. As Sarah just mentioned, the title and topic today is Succession Planning, Organizational Stability, and Leadership Development. This is our first webinar in our Organizational Effectiveness series. On March 19th, we'll be offering a webinar on workforce safety for syringe service programs, and on March 23rd, a webinar on cultural humility and responsiveness in HIV service delivery. We hope you will be able to join us for all three in the series, but if not, each webinar will be posted on Age United's website in the resource library. As I mentioned, I'm Zach Ford, Program Manager here at Age United for this Puerto Rico Sector Transformation and Syringe Access Fund programs. So Sector Transformation is a privately funded grant-making initiative that's generously supported by Johnson & Johnson. Sector Transformation was designed to help AIDS service organizations and HIV-focused community-based organizations respond to changes in federal health policy and HIV funding. For those interested in Sector Transformation support, you can visit the Age United website to learn more. Our deadline for submitting an LOI for Sector Transformation is tomorrow, March 14th. If you have any questions about that, please feel free to reach out to me after the webinar.
This webinar is being recorded and will be available on Age United's website along with the slides after the event.
In 2016, Age United's Sector Transformation program saw a critical need in the field for succession planning. We collaborated with consultants at RAFA in Washington, D.C. to offer a succession planning institute. The institute was such a success that we've offered it 3 times, including once in Puerto Rico. Today's webinar will feature Rachel Gibson, a senior consultant at RAFA. Rachel has led each succession planning institute and worked one-on-one with leaders in the field who have participated. We're also joined today by Debbie Warren, the president and CEO of RAIN in Charlotte, North Carolina, and Phil Wilson, president and CEO of the Black AIDS Institute in Los Angeles. Both Debbie and Phil have been through Age United Succession Planning Institute, and they will discuss their experiences with implementing succession plans in their organizations. And with that, I will turn it over to Rachel to get us started.
Thank you, Zach. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rachel Gibson, a senior consultant at RAFA, and I am a change management expert, but I would say 99% of my work is focused on working with organizations that are led by founders or long-tenured or transformative leaders, and supporting those organizations as they implement succession and transition management, transition planning engagements. So to get a better sense of who is on the webinar, we have a few polls. We want this to be as responsive as it can be to your needs, as well as interactive. So there's a poll now on your screen. If you could indicate on that poll whether or not you're a CEO or executive director, a staff member, or a board member. If you can take literally 1 second to complete that poll. And Zach, will we see the poll results up after the poll?
Yes, when you click the your response and you hit submit, you should see the results. Great.
So we have 42% of you, almost 43% are executive directors, and then we have staff members. I would assume some of you who are staff members are senior leaders in your organization. And we don't have any board members, but this webinar is recorded. We'll have slides, and so for those of you who are CEOs or executive directors, we hope that you'll share this information with your board, because a part of this webinar includes the board's role as well as the staff's role in implementing this work. For those of you who are CEOs, indicate whether or not you are the founder of your organization. And that could be you're the one who signed the incorporation letters, and or that could be you're the first paid staff person. So spend a second to indicate what you are. Great, look at that. So we have 50-50. We have a good number of you are founders, some of you are not. And if you are a CEO, how long have you served in your role? Less than 5 years, 5 to 10, 10 to 20, or 20 plus? Interesting. I have to skip by. Okay. So 5 to 10 years, 10 to 20 years for some of you. So a third of you who are executives, 10 to 20 years. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about, for those of you who've been with your organization for 10 to 20 years, even if you've been there for 9 years, you know setting up systems and putting things in place for your departure is not easy. And so we will talk through what you need to be thinking through, particularly given how long-term you are. For those of you less than 5 years, it's exciting that you're actually on this, because we say a lot of this work is a best practice regardless of how long you've been in your role. And then our last poll is, what's your departure timeline? So less than a year, 1 to 2 years, or 2 to 3 years, or maybe you just don't know. Okay. So we have some of you are 1 to 2 years. We have 2 to 3, less than a year, and you don't know. Again, glad that the don't knows are on this, because this is a best practice. For those of you who are on this webinar and you're less than a year, there's a lot that we'll go through, and it's not to demoralize you if you're leaving in 6 months, even if you're leaving in 3 months. I think the hope is that you'll be able to pick something up that you can implement regardless of your departure timeline. For those of you in the 2 to 3 year category, this is perfect timing for you to be thinking about this. We say that transition is really a multi-year process. If you have been in your role for up to 20 years, you really do need about 2 to 3 years to start thinking about this. Now, mark you, doesn't mean you're communicating your intention 2 to 3 years in advance. We would never recommend that. But you should at least be thinking about how you're going to set your organization up for success in the event that you leave in 3 years. So thank you very much for participating in the poll. That helps us to be more responsive to what you may be top of mind for you. So our conversation will focus. I will provide a very high level best practice type overview of succession and transition planning, and our 2 guest speakers will do the more real life, how did this work or not work for them. So you'll have the high level, but you'll also hear the practical. So it's a lot of information. Again, you'll have these slides if you want to go back to it and kind of process some of this stuff. So why plan for this work? Why even do this? Why plan for succession? We all know, we all hear about this hit by a bus or win the lottery scenario, but the reality is many of us have colleagues who have had medical issues, have had to relocate, family issues, and so the question is, how can you not plan for succession and transition management? And for some of you who are executive directors who, it's very hard to bring this up to your board, because you bring this to your board, you bring this to a funder to fund the work, and and there's this alarm, there's this question about whether or not you're leaving tomorrow. And these right here, I mean, your slide, these are talking points for how you can talk about this. Succession planning mitigates risk, right? It is about the board playing a very key responsibility in terms of ensuring that there's leader continuity at the CEO level. It's about ensuring that there's organizational sustainability. It helps to build your bench strength. So for those of you who are staff members, succession planning is not only about your executive director. ED succession planning is also about you and how you are building your own leader development and how your executive director is appropriately delegating to you. And so it is all about ensuring leader continuity and mitigating risk. And before I get too deep, I wanted to define two key terms. Often we get the words confused. We talk about succession planning, and there's this assumption that what we mean is executive search, and it's not. So succession planning is an ongoing, continuous process that boards, I would say also CEOs, undertake to really strengthen the foundation of that executive position. And strengthening the foundation means strengthening what it takes to ensure that the key leader, the CEO, is set up for success. And that confirmation is not solely about ensuring that you fill the seat with somebody, but ensuring that the organization is solid and can withstand an executive transition. So a part of that includes clarifying your strategy. It includes building your infrastructure, and it is about a best practice. An executive transition and search, an executive search is something that occurs at a moment. It's a lot of the hiring and recruiting of that person. And so what we'll talk about in this webinar is that the search is an event. Transition is a multi-year process. In our work, we see transition really lasting 3 years. And so I wanted to kind of put those definitions out there because what we're talking about today is around the succession planning piece. So what we find in our work, particularly with long-tenured executives, is that you spend a lot of time leading your organization, right? Especially if you're a small staff, you're strapped for resources and capacity. You're doing a lot of leading, right? You are handling everything. You have your hands in everything because that's just how things have to get done, right? Both the program as well as the administrative and operations piece. And that there's little time really preparing for the organization to be able to function and thrive outside of your leadership. And then even thinking about what your life will be after you leave this organization, you can't even fathom it because you're spending so much time actually doing the work. The healthier balance is that, yes, you're leading the organization, so you are providing some oversight of finances, you may be providing oversight of development, but that you're in a space where you're also being intentional. You are thinking about the best and highest use of your time so that you can prepare the organization to thrive outside of your leadership. And we'll talk about what goes into this preparation, but we often say that there is preparing the organization, but also preparing yourself personally for your life outside of it. And so, and I don't know if Debbie will talk about this, but there's a part of that preparing your, creating a great rest of your life is oftentimes sometimes getting an executive coach or having a mentor, just somebody, some outlet to be able to help you think about your life outside and what you're heading towards. So we have 3 phases in a transition process: the prepare, the search, the onboard. Oftentimes when we talk about transition, we think about the search, the tactics behind finding somebody. We oftentimes forget the prepare and we ignore the onboard. We're not talking today about the search and the onboarding piece. They're equally as important, but of course it's a 1-hour webinar. So we'll talk through that preparation. In preparing your organization, the first step is to really agree on what are the priorities of our organization. And yeah, sometimes that's in a strategic plan and sometimes it's not, right? And so what is the strategic direction of your organization? What impact does it have on future leadership needs? If you are the founder or you've been there for 20 years, the leader of tomorrow is will probably have different skill sets than your leadership. Well, what does that mean? If you're currently in transition, so for those of you who said you have less than a year departure timeline, what you're saying to yourself is, what are the 12 to 18-month organizational priorities, and what does your new executive need to really accomplish in those 2 years? And so if you don't start there, if you start first on where do we recruit this, hire the next person, or where do we recruit, you're going to be missing out. So what we say around when you think about a simple way to think about the priorities of your organization is to ask a series of questions related to these 4 dimensions. So a really humming organization will have a very clear business model and strategy. They'll have high-functioning board and solid senior leadership team or management team, great resources. Resources, not just money, but reputation, in-kind support, and all of that's impacted by your culture. If you are a founder or a long-tenured executive, your leadership, regardless of if you realize this, you impact culture more than anything. And so when transitions go sour, oftentimes it's because the culture that you have created impacts so many other aspects of the organization that everything falls apart. And so naming your culture, naming the aspects of the culture that impacts the way money comes into your organization is key, because that helps you think through how will the organization buffer when that critical component is missing. So we could do a whole half-day session just on this, which we do, and Debbie and Phil can say it, can agree to that or attest to that. But I'm going to skip to the actual succession planning essential tools that you need, and we can always do a follow-up to go more deeply into how best to define organizational priorities. So you may say, okay, Rachel, I heard all this. Wonderful. Just give me the basics of what do I need to do to at least have some baseline things in place. So for those of you who may be leaving, say, in a year and you just want some baseline stuff, right, we have kind of really broken it up. So at the very least, you should have a sense of, you should have your essential succession planning stuff in place, for lack of a better term. So succession essentials include having emergency backup plans for key leadership or key staff. Key staff does not necessarily mean your top leadership. It does not necessarily mean your deputy director. Key staff could include, if you're a small staff, your office manager who's been there for 15 of your 16 years, that were he or her to leave tomorrow, things could potentially fall apart, and therefore you want to ensure continuity and actually have stated backup plans. You should also at the very least have a succession policy. We'll talk about what that is. If you have maybe a 2-year runway, really be thinking about leader development. For those of you who are thinking about leaving in 2 to 3 years, what are you going to do proactively around developing your leaders within your organization? Not necessarily to be the next CEO, but ensuring that they're able to really provide solid support to whoever comes in after you. And if you have a defined timeline, you know when you're leaving, at the very least you have to have a sense of what is the transition plan, so what are some tactics that you're going to put in place to ensure that what are some action steps that you're going to do prior to you leaving. And sustainability planning means, what are some either capacity building priorities or larger organizational development needs that your organization has. You can't fix your organization before you leave, but maybe what you do is you pick one or two key things that keep you up at night and may keep the other person up at night. And so you probably want to spend some time looking at that. We'll talk a little bit about these three things very high level, but another poll. If you could share whether or not your organization has a written board-adopted succession policy. If you're a CEO, for the CEO, yes, no, not sure. The important word there is board-adopted. So not a succession policy that you did in a nonprofit management class, but one that the board approved. Okay. Excellent. So, actually not excellent. So none of you have one. 50% of you said no, and then the rest of you aren't sure. All right. So, other poll. Does your organization have emergency succession plan? So there's a little typo there, but that's okay. So emergency succession plan for either your CEO, senior leader, key employee, just anybody. Okay, so few of you yes, a number of you no, and some of you not sure. Okay. Does your organization have an intentional method for developing leaders within your organization? Keyword there is intentional. So it could be in performance reviews. It could be specific coaching. So, this is music to my ears that 44% of you said yes. 33% of you said no, and then some of you said not sure. If you're not sure, then I would probably guess that you don't have one. But I'm happy that you do. I'll tell you, it is the key to success in terms of leader development. So let's quickly talk through succession policy. I don't want to use too much time. We have a few more slides. A succession policy is really a board policy. It lays out what do you do to handle a CEO departure. So are you going to use an interim? Who's the transition committee? How do you communicate? The point of a succession policy is to ensure that when you do say to the board that I do want to leave, that they've thought through things, right? That they're not making decisions in the time of emotions, that they can quickly implement action steps. And so even if you don't have a departure timeline or departure date, it's really good to have a succession policy. Emergency backup plans, again, a lot of these slides are so that you can have that to use as talking points. One thing, for those of you who are executive directors, when you talk to your staff about emergency backup plans, it's important to say to them, this is not about you losing your job. This is not about us replacing you. This is about ensuring that we have continuity of key functions were something to happen. And it's ensuring that we can identify our gaps, that there's professional development and cross-training, that we know who holds key relationships in our organization. So these are the talking points that you'll use when talking to staff about the importance of emergency backup planning. Leader development, the same thing. If folks are wondering, how does leader development fit into this? What this is that you have a stronger pipeline. Like, it is a wonderful thing when you are an outgoing person, an outgoing CEO, and you have two people in your organization who could potentially be the next executive director. For that to happen, you have to be very intentional about it. And if you are intentional about it, it absolutely heightens staff morale. So where does the board fit in? Where does the staff or the CEO fit in? board's role, as a board member, boards have to understand the strategic priorities, right? They have to understand the core competencies of the CEO and how that fits in to the priorities. They have to know do some salary surveying. They have to get a sense of, is their executive director being paid market rate? They should never find that out when they're about to launch a search, because if they're not being paid market rate, you can either decide, how do we over the next few years intentionally raise our salary, or how do we communicate this to potential candidates? Succession policy, of course. As a CEO, your role is to help the board understand the priorities, to really, really educate them about the culture and the values. I know that there are some of you on this webinar who are scared to leave because you are worried that somebody will come in and tear down this amazing culture that you have built. Well, guess what? The only way to ensure that that doesn't happen is that you are intentional as much as you can around educating the decision makers, which are the board, about what this culture is and how it drives the impact of your work. So there are roles that you each play. This is not just about the CEO, and that's what's important. And finally, particularly for those of you who are long-tenured or transformational leaders, change is hard, right? So when you get to that point where you announce that you are leaving, expect grief, expect people not wanting to let go. For those of you who are currently in transition and you may have some tensions and maybe some staff morale issues, you're in this kind of neutral zone. That happens. What you're seeing in front of you is the William Bridges' model of coming to terms with change. What it says is that there are 3 phases of change. There's that ending, that loss, that letting go. That's hard for people. They transition into that neutral zone, which is confusion, in some cases low self, low morale, before they get to that new beginning. And the new beginning is where they really start to accept the new, right? It's not when change happens. It's their acceptance of it. You as an executive who are leaving, you're probably already in a new beginning. You're probably thinking about what you're going to do after you leave, while many people on staff may still be in that ending zone. So what this slide is basically saying is appreciate emotions around this, no matter how many processes you have in place. There are people behind all of this. It's hard. Change is not easy, and that should always be taken into consideration. So that's my high level, and then I will turn it over to Debbie at Rain to share her story.
Thank you, Rachel. Well, first let me say what a great experience I've had participating in the succession planning cohort with RAFA and Age United. It's truly been enlightening, and it's helped put firm ground underneath my feet and underneath Rain's feet. We're in Charlotte, North Carolina. We are going to be hosting one of the NCAA basketball tournaments coming up this week. Rain was founded in the early 90s to provide compassionate end-of-life care to people with AIDS. Many of us did that early work, and we've transitioned to provide medical case management, youth services, mental health, ACA enrollment, access to PrEP and PEP, and all the new interventions. When I began the process with RAFA, I really didn't realize the weight of so many unanswered questions, and I think I carried a lot of anxiety unknowingly. But as I began to learn more about what we needed to have in place at RAIN, it began to sink in really on a deeper level. If it's in your mind, sometimes it's not really real, but when you begin to talk about it, it's made real. And so, as Rachel said earlier, I began to experience some grief knowing that one day I will actually leave RAIN. And I've been with the organization as the founder. Soon it will be nearly 27 years. I had identified an internal successor, and I had begun to groom her, and she and I had discussed this, but I had not discussed it with anybody else. Rachel has teased me about how much I've held in my head that I had not communicated. I had some misguided ideas about the timing of announcing a departure, and really and truly about the amount of time it takes to prepare an organization for a founder's departure. But it's been so helpful to me to learn the best practices for founders and long-tenured executives, and I found a lot of relief from obtaining that kind of clarity and knowing exactly what has to happen at certain intervals as I transition towards retirement. And one of the greatest gifts of the process has been the assignment of a retirement coach, Amy Harbison, who's a certified transition coach. These are not financial planners. There are all kinds of folks who do financial planning, but these are people who are only interested in our own well-being. Many of us have spent our entire lives or much of our professional careers thinking, planning, worrying about our organizations, really involved in the operations and strategies and so forth. And one day she just stopped me dead cold by saying, you need to think about your life apart from Rain and what the next phase of your life is going to be and what you want for yourself. Do you realize that every decision you make is about what's in the best interest of Rain? And no one had really ever said anything like that to me before, so it was quite an eye-opening conversation. She really guided me to reflect on a lot of important key questions about the future. What do I want to do and not do in my last years or months at Rain? And from the heart, what do I really want to focus on? And what do I want my legacy to be? And what has to happen in the next months and years? And what are the milestones, the events that will make me feel complete as I depart from Rain? These were really crucial conversations, important conversations and important reflections. As I learned more about the process, there were so many things to do, and it could be overwhelming. But one of the things that Rachel provided is an organizational assessment, and that's enabled me to prioritize the work to be done and to work on it in increments, like the things she mentioned earlier in the webinar: emergency backup planning and having succession planning documents in place and being clear about strategy and so forth. But it's been a great experience for me. It came along at just the right time, and I'll be forever grateful for this opportunity, both with RAFA and Age United.
Great. Thank you, Debbie. And now we're going to transition to hear what Phil has to say about his experience with succession planning.
Well, thank you, Zach. And I certainly want to thank Rachel and Age United for the work and the help on this issue. And it's always a pleasure to share time and space with Debbie. Things are come full circle. Debbie and I were together with a Ford Foundation project called Leaders for a Changing World in the early days of the Black AIDS Institute, where there's a lot of important lessons learned about, what does it mean to have transformational leadership. One of the things that I think might be unique about the Black AIDS Institute's experience is that there has embedded into our entire culture is not necessarily in the front of our minds, but certainly in the back of our minds, is the whole notion around succession planning, having an HIV positive leader in the early days of the AIDS epidemic, when we're always waiting for the other shoe to drop. So, kind of that issue in the background in our early development, I think, has influenced the way we have gone about and approached succession planning. Key to it, I think, is, as Rachel said, tying succession planning for us is sustainability planning. And as Rachel said, that succession planning is not just transition at the top of the leadership, but throughout the organization. And so we've spent a lot of time through our entire history looking at leadership development, quite frankly, anticipating that at some point we would need a new leader. Fortunately, with the changes in biomedical interventions in the care and treatment for people living with HIV, we did not have to face a transition that was driven by illness. The first step for us in this process happened probably 5 or 6 years ago, when we seriously began to talk about succession planning in the organization. And a part of that was tied to kind of divorcing the identity of the organization from the identity of the president and CEO. There was a period in time when people would refer to our organization as Phil's organization. And we took that as a danger sign, and we're very, very aggressive around addressing that. People actually don't even know that the official name for the Black AIDS Institute is the AIDS Policy and Training Institute. Now try saying that 5 times forward and backwards and see how far you get. So one of the things we realized is that we needed to identify the organization in a way that people could quickly grab hold to it and not use the default associating the organization with me personally. And there, out of that was born the Black AIDS Institute, or BAI. So kind of looking at that divorce between the identity of the individual leader and the organization was key to us. Second, as a part of that, was the expansion and the diversification of on both a board level and the staff level on issues around visibility and decision making. As often happens with a leader of an organization, that person is also often the voice of the organization or the primary spokesperson. And so we began to do a lot of work around expanding who the spokespeople were for the organization, putting forward in a big way our board leadership. Jesse Mylan, who is the current president and CEO of AIDS United, at one point was our board chair and began speaking on behalf of the organization. Our current board chair, Grizel Howard, is often a spokesperson for the organization. And we have other staff members now who are also spokespeople for the organization, Alicia McKinley Beach and Rania Copeland, for example. So expanding who the spokespeople were in the organization. The second thing is expanding the decision making so that more people had the ability to make decisions for the organization, and the organization would stand behind those decisions. And so that means that the organization could move forward, and we began to eliminate the bottleneck that would happen when there's a singular decision maker. And it also, again, strengthened the identity of the organization. The next thing that we did was around transparency. And I'll just use one example that we felt was really, really important around transparency. And that is, we actually made this decision 10 years ago, and that was every month we share our financials with everyone on our staff, from the entry-level clerk to the senior staff, the exact same information that the board gets every month. So no matter who you are, if you work for the Black AIDS Institute, every month you get the insider's information on the state of our finances, on the budget, on all those elements. And so transparency, we think, was a critical part of our sustainability and our succession planning process. Tactically, for us, as we go through this process, and maybe I should have said this early on, but we are in the final 6 months of our succession planning process. We have announced that I'm leaving, and we've set a time period for that to happen. So tactically, one of the things that we did 4 years ago was I went on a 6-month sabbatical. So I was away, in fact, out of the country for 6 months, and we set up, it was kind of a trial run to see where we were relative to our internal ability to lead. And the experiment was extremely successful, which should not be confused with smooth. So there were 2 points of my sabbatical. One, I needed a sabbatical, irregardless of everything else. But two, we wanted to understand better where we were in our own internal leadership development. What we discovered is that internally, with our existing staff, while we had a number of strong points, there were still gaps that needed to be addressed. We were not as well prepared in kind of the hit by the bus kind of notion. And so as a part of that, we began to look at continuity and institutional memory and looking at those gaps. We officially made the decision around transition a little over a year ago. We made it actually in December of 2016. I personally actually made it in November of 2016. Some of you may know that something happened in November of 2016 that I have to admit was instrumental in my making that decision. But as an organization, we made it in December of 2016. We decided that we wanted the process to be finished within the third and no later than the fourth quarter of 2018. And so with that, in January of 2017, we began a 6-month strategic planning process that included succession planning as a part of that process. And as a part of that, we set 5-year goals and objectives with the assumption that at some point in that 5 years, the current executive leadership would change. And we asked ourselves, the fundamentally 2 questions. One, who are we? Are we the right size? Are we doing the right work? Do we have the right staff? Do we have the right leadership? And then we ask ourselves, a third question is that in our future, what are we going to do? Are we going to go? Are we going to grow, meaning to get bigger in what we're going to do, what we're currently doing? Are we going to change from what we're currently doing to something else? Are we going to merge with someone else, or are we going to go, which means we're going to close our doors? And we went through an exercise to decide what we were going to do, and what we decided in that exercise is that we would both grow and change. And we're working with AIDS United around succession and sector transformation as well. So then, in the third quarter of 2017, we actually entered into a very specific succession planning process that was more robust than the succession planning piece that was in our previous strategic planning process. And in that, we developed a more precise timeline, a communication strategy, organizational development strategy, including cultural issues, and then a search strategy. And then as a part of that, along the way, this is actually out of sequence, but we also looked at the 4 tent poles of organizational development. One is the tent pole around development. And so strengthening our development apparatus in our organization so that we could raise funds for the present and the future. 2, programmatically, strengthening our programming, making sure that our programs were the right size, and thinking about programs for the future. 3, financial management, making sure that our financial management house was in order. And 4, governance, making sure we, in fact, had an engaged board that was working on the work that we were doing. And so with that, then we began the process in January. In December of this year, we made an announcement to our in November of 2017, we made a formal announcement to the entirety of the board, which was kind of a reminder announcement. In December, we announced the information to our executive staff, and then in January, we announced the information, we shared the information with our whole staff. And during the month of January, we did personal calls to our key stakeholders to let them know that we were doing this. And then in February, we made a public announcement. And as a part of that public announcement, what was very important to us, that the announcement around a transition in executive leadership was a part of a much larger announcement as we prepare for the next generation of HIV/AIDS response in Black communities. So announcing my departure was a part of a larger announcement around programs that we're going to be doing in the Black AIDS Institute, which includes dramatic expansion, sector transformational expansion in the programs that we're doing locally in Los Angeles. Now, opening a prevention clinic, opening a primary men's clinic, opening a gay men's drop-in center, partnering with a clinical provider in Los Angeles to provide direct clinical care, which is an area of work that we've not historically done. On a national level, launching a Black Women's Initiative, which we did last week, and a national policy initiative, and a national training and capacity building initiative for health departments. So when we announced that we were seeking new executive leadership, we announced it in a context around preparation for the future. And that's the way we talk about it internally. That's the way we're expressing it externally. And then the final step is really making sure we're doing staff support internally. So we have regular meetings where staff get a chance to talk about where they are in the cycle of accepting and processing change. We have 2 staff members who sit on the search committee for the new president and CEO. We have a standing report that around the search process that the staff gets every month, and there's a commitment that before a final decision is made, that the staff will have a chance to have conversations with the final candidate. I played a role in selecting the search firm, but I am playing no role, and nor do I have any additional insight to what's going on in the search process itself beyond what is reported to the staff in general. And so finally, what we are doing now is we are in the process of either introducing or reintroducing our organizational members beyond myself to the world. So every week in our weekly if any of you follow us, every week we are trying to introduce either a new staff member or a new board member or a new ambassador, so people are familiar with the larger organization beyond their association with me as the current president and CEO. So thank you.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you, Debbie, as well. So before we enter the Q&A, I want to make a brief announcement. So on Age United's website, today we formally launched the Succession Planning Learning module. So this has resources from the Succession Planning Institutes, including PowerPoint presentations from the virtual meetings that Rachel conducted with each cohort. And then we also have some really great templates that Rafa created that are available on this website. So if you go to www.ageunited.org/resources, you'll see the Succession Planning Learning module listed there. You'll also see a recording of this webinar if you want to listen to this really wonderful information again. But we really encourage you to check that out. It's got some really fabulous resources. So now we're going to transition into the Q&A portion. We have about 8 minutes left here. In the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, you should see a blue chat icon. If you have questions for our presenters, please feel free to type the message in there, and we will do as many as we can in the last few minutes. So I'm going to get us started here with a question, and this is for both Debbie and Phil. I was wondering, the role of an executive director, I think, as a staff member at a nonprofit, I see that it doesn't always look that desirable. So I was wondering if you all could speak to how you've made your role as the CEO and the president more doable so that the staff in the organization look at it as a role that they might want to fill one day, and so that those outside of the organization see it as an attractive career opportunity for them.
Thank you, Zach. And first of all, I want to thank you, Phil, for reminding me about the Ford Foundation Leadership for a Changing World. I had forgotten about that, and so thank you for that and for sharing space with you today. I think I've had to change out of necessity, Zach. I think the job wasn't doable, but I had to raise my own awareness of that and invite the leadership of key staff members to share in the workload. And that's not only been good for me personally, but good for RAIN and good for leadership development within our organization. And for me, it's always, so much of my work through the years has been about relationship building. And so I take great joy in that. And so I think our staff members experience that kind of joy as I share relationships with them and opportunities with them to build their relationships as well. I'll defer to Phil now.
I don't know if I've done a good job at all to the way you asked the question. I think that sadly, for many people on our staff, there's a perception that the job is not doable. I think that the things that we have done, and I am proud of, is that we've done a very good job, as Debbie has talked about, around diversifying and delegation. That we have different people in our organization that are completely autonomous in the programs they work on and the decision making that they are able to make, and the ownership that they get to make of the programs. I think that the area that what I would say is that number one, to always be acutely aware of the privilege in having been given the opportunity to change things and to have the privilege of having an idea and the opportunity to possibly bring that idea to fruition. So I'm always clear about that, and I think that there's a great appreciation among our staff of what a privilege that is as well, and what a thrill that is, to be able to wake up one day and think that, wouldn't it be great if X happened? So for example, the Black Women's HIV project that we just launched last week was the brainchild of a coordinator at the Black AIDS Institute, which is one of our entry-level job titles. So this was a coordinator's idea, and within 60 days from her saying, I have this idea, we developed and operationalized and produced and announced a major initiative. And so I think providing staff with the opportunity to experience that is really important.
Thank you both. I know that and I'm sure the participants as well, really appreciate your honesty. So my next question is, when you consider leadership development and nurturing the next generation of leaders, how have you approached generational gaps? And how have you addressed the lack of lived experience that simply cannot be attained by folks who were born after the AIDS epidemic started? And either of you can feel free to answer that.
Well, I'll start on this one since Debbie started on the other one. And Zach, thank you. It is a challenge, a huge challenge. I think the way that we basically just jumped in two ways. One, I have to remind myself that I was 26 when I started to do AIDS work. So, I was not always an old person, and I didn't always have a lived experience. So respecting the lived experience of others and kind of pushing as challenging as it can be to do that. The second thing is that on our staff now, 90% of our staff is under 35, and probably fully 80% of our staff is under 30. And so we made a very deliberate choice to kind of have a staff that reflects the epidemic, both racially, and on a gender basis and sexual orientation, and also based on age. And so the ability to kind of just jump in, to have young people on staff, for those young people to have to play leadership roles, but to have the advantage of mentors and folks that can guide them or counsel them or coach them based on a shared experience. And then finally, hold people accountable, to not have, not be guilty of the bias of low expectations.
I would just also say it's, people learn so differently. I'm a baby boomer, and so the way I went about my work and the way I learn and the way I perform is entirely different. And on our staff, we have many people who actually were a part of our initial programs, and out of their programs we saw leadership and we saw opportunities for people to have their first professional jobs. So not only do we have millennials, but we have people in their first professional jobs, and that's been very rewarding to see. But it does take more time to step back and look at how differently this generation learns and how they love to have much more feedback and much more coaching than my generation. And so I don't think we've done as good a job with that as we could have, but we are in the midst of a transition to learn to do a better job with coaching and providing learning for our employees.
Great. Thank you all so much. I want to, we've reached our 3 o'clock time, so unfortunately we have to say goodbye. But before we do, I want to say thank you to Rachel for joining us and giving us that wonderful top-level overview of succession planning. And thank you so much to Debbie and Phil. I know that the lives of president and CEOs, it's a busy one, and so we really and truly appreciate you taking the time to share your experience around succession planning with us today. As a quick reminder, this will be available on our website, and we encourage you to go check out the resource page on Age United's site to explore the succession planning learning module. Thank you all so much, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Zach.
Take care.